I want to sort of frame my talk tonight. This is not strictly a history talk. I want to talk a little bit about why Germantown is special. Why do we keep coming back to this place? Why is it so important to us? Why does it matter to preserve this history? And almost take you through sort of a greatest hits of Germantown. What are the things that really resonate, the extraordinary things that stand out throughout its history? So historic Germantown, in addition to being a place, is also this consortium, this really extraordinary consortium of historic sites. Let me tell you, someone who's been in historic site work for 20 plus years, historic organizations are very insular. We all think we're special. That's the reason we're founded, right? And so it's hard for us to naturally step out of that and collaborate and work together as organizations. So it's really pretty extraordinary when you get a group like this that is working together on so many levels. And just to sort of put a point on that, Historic Germantown today is a partnership of 19 organizations. So it is mostly historic sites, but it includes Albury Arboretum, it includes the Colored Girls Museum, it includes the Black Writers Museum. So it's really this breadth of cultural institutions in North and Northwest Philadelphia. It includes cemeteries like Hood Cemetery and Fairhill Burial Ground. And so you get a little smattering of that here. We have LaSalle Art Museum, Stenton, my museum, Ebenezer Maxwell Museum, Germantown Mennonite Historic Trust, the Black Writers Museum, which is now located at Vernon House in Vernon Park, and the Gate to Hood Cemetery down below. So what makes Germantown special? Why do we have this really well-preserved historic fabric in this community to start with? There are a number of reasons. One is, of course, the history of this community. One reason is benign neglect and lack of development over the years. Another reason is we've dodged bullets, like the bypasses that were planned over many years and never completed or executed. And yet another reason is this very early interest in preservation, which grows out of the centennial in 1876 and is largely led by ladies' organizations. And that includes organizations like my own, the National Society of the Colonial Dames in Pennsylvania. And here you see them at opening day at Stenton in 1900. As Sibby said, Germantown is home to America's longest National Historic District. So that stretches from Wayne Junction to, I believe, Upsall is the cross street. So really pretty amazing in that sense. And there may be more at this point, but there are no less than 7 national historic landmarks within the Germantown's boundaries. And David Young, who I'm sure many of you know and remember, who worked at the Johnson House in Clifton for many years, completed a book a few years ago called The Battles of Germantown, which really focused in on kind of public history and contested histories and how Germantown got to where it is today. But this is a quote of his. In many ways, Germantown's history touches on several of the most salient chapters of America's struggle for religious toleration, freedom, and independence. And I think simply distilled, we can look at Old City. We can think about going to Independence Hall and going to see the Liberty Bell. And what are you getting? You're getting the Revolution, the Revolution, the Revolution, maybe a little bit of early Federal as well. But here in Germantown, we can touch on 300 years of history. I mean, we have moments in Germantown's history that connect to American history throughout, and that's really extraordinary. So Germantown, as many of you probably know, is founded by Francis Daniel Pastorius, and there's actually a cousin of William Penn and representatives of 13 families from the Krefeld area of Germany who approached Pastorius about representing them as their agent. Germany is not a nation, of course, like it is today. At this time, it's a bunch of little, essentially German kingdoms, and these are people who want to search for a place that is more tolerant from a religious standpoint. They've grown sort of disenchanted with Lutheranism. They're looking for economic opportunity, and Pastorius purchases 15,000 acres on behalf of the group in what is known today as Germantown. So Pastorius has ties to William Penn and to his provincial secretary, James Logan, and he becomes important in his own right. Germantown at this time is not part of Philadelphia. It's established separately. It has its own governance. At one point, Pastorius is the mayor of Germantown. He represents the area in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. And he is also really a scholar and a prolific writer as well. Germantown, not technically Germantown, but just below Germantown, is home to the provincial secretary, James Logan. The provincial secretary is recruited by William Penn and is essentially his right-hand man. And if you're not aware, William Penn went back to England in 1701 and never set foot here again. So initially, William Penn and later the Penn family rely very heavily on James Logan to oversee their affairs in the colony. And he's arguably the most influential man in the colony in the first half of the 18th century. So Germantown, because of this, is really a seat of power. It's a destination. People are coming here to see James Logan, to seek his input and his advice. And that's something that's notable. The area sort of south of Germantown where he builds his house, which is today Nicetown, and where Nicetown and Logan are, is known as the Bristol Township or the Liberties at this time. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the skull and heap map, which is first published in the middle of the 18th century, and then it's revised. Later editions are published. But this just gives you a sense of where Germantown is in relation to Philadelphia at that time in the 18th century. So the kind of mass of red blocks that we see here is the layout of Philadelphia, although the only occupied part is the darkly shaded section there, which is what we call today Old City, of course. Germantown is this little kind of caterpillar-like thing along what we call today the Germantown Avenue or the Germantown Road. It was known variously over time as Main Street and by other names, but it really started out as a Native American trading trail, and then it becomes this colonial road, and then ultimately becomes the Great Road. It's one of the primary arteries for immigration, so new immigrants who are coming in, moving out westward to Pennsylvania, sometimes ultimately down the Shenandoah Valley, are taking this road out to the west. And if you look along here, you notice there's this dense concentration of houses, and that's very deliberate. And you can see, again, these are sort of 1770s era maps of Germantown, but you can see this spine here, sort of settlement. And then in the lower right, you see these very narrow lots that are numbered 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So Germantown was designed as this sort of urban village where you would have density of houses along Germantown Avenue or the Germantown Road, but you would have these long, narrow, arable lots that could be farmed. And some of these largely survive intact today. Think about the Johnson House, for instance, has pretty narrow frontage, but its lot went all the way down to the Wissahickon Creek. So it had this incredibly deep lot that was farmable. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the 1688 petition, which is really an extraordinary document. The story of how it was lost and found is also really something, but that's a whole other story. But the 1688 petition is created by Pastorius and a group from these early families who gathered together at the Kunder's house. And they really see slavery as an injustice. And this, at the time, is, I think, a real cultural difference between these German Quaker converts. A lot of them, when they come over, are Mennonites or Dunkards, but they ultimately convert to Quakerism. And the English Quakers, who really held power in Pennsylvania. So they create this petition, and the petition really essentially is based on the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. So they argue that regardless of skin color, enslaved or not, we should treat people the way that we want to be treated. And they draft this petition, and it's unclear what they expect to happen if they think that the English Quakers will suddenly give up all their slaves. But it's sent to the Abington meeting for review, and the Abington meeting looks at this, and they decide that it is far too weighty for them to decide. So they send it up to the Philadelphia Quarterly meeting, who also look at it, kick the can down the road, far too weighty for us to decide. They send it to the Philadelphia Yearly meeting, and ultimately it is rejected by the Philadelphia Yearly meeting. But it is the first example of a petition, a written petition against slavery by a religious group in colonial America. And if you've been to Germantown Mennonite Historic Trust, they have this table, which by oral tradition is the table on which the petition was originally written. The Kunder's house, unfortunately, no longer survives, but the name, I guess, associated with at least is memorialized in Freedom Square, which is the strip mall today. Germantown was home to the New World's first paper mill, which was started in 1690 by William Rittenhouse, first paper mill in British North America. And David Rittenhouse was born there in 1732. He becomes well known for his ability to make well-worn clocks and scientific instruments. If you're really interested in this, Don Fenimore just published a whole book on Rittenhouse clocks. But he also is famously known for being the first to observe the transit of Venus in 1769, which he actually fainted during. And he ultimately became the first director of the U.S. Mint. But if you've ever traveled along Lincoln Drive, you've seen, Rittenhouse Town many times and the location of this first paper mill. Germantown is home to America's oldest Mennonite congregation. So in 1708, the Mennonites built their first meeting house here, which was a simple log cabin. The current version that survives, which is on Germantown Avenue, was built in 1770 by Jacob Knorr. There is a marvelous cemetery there if you like early graves and cemeteries. About 200 graves. You can see one of those here, which dates to 1736. And the other really interesting thing about the Mennonites is how they later on become involved in preservation. So they are really involved in saving historic Rittenhouse Town first. They also become involved in saving the Johnson House. Ultimately, those are spun off into separate entities that administer them. But they really leave their mark on Germantown in terms of preservation, and also moving us beyond the kind of colonial and Revolutionary War era stories that were really held up high during the colonial revival era. Those, of course, tended to overlook African American history, Native American history, women's history. And so Germantown Mennonite is responsible for helping us broaden those stories. Printing in Germantown, we have firsts in printing as well. David Billmeyer, Christopher Sauer. Christopher Sauer set up his shop in 1735, not terribly far from here, and is responsible for publishing the first European language Bible in America, which would have been Martin Luther's German translation. So, of course, we move into the Revolution. Everyone's heard of the Battle of Germantown, right? October 4th, 1777. A typical loss for George Washington, unfortunately. But what it really showed was that the Americans could, for the first time, muster a well-organized, large-scale attack. And so George Washington brought about 11,000 men to Germantown. There were 9,000 British soldiers occupying the area at the time. And Washington led this attack. Clifton ended up really being the thorn in the side of the Americans at the battle. They never dislodged the 100 or so British soldiers that holed up in the house and turned it into a fortress. They suffered heavy casualties and ultimately ended up withdrawing. But the fact that they could surprise the British and muster this large-scale attack showed potential allies like the French that it was worth investing in our revolution. And that was one of the things I think that pushed the French ultimately to come over to our side. In the New Republic, Germantown also becomes home to, we call it today the Germantown White House, but the Dessler Morris House serves essentially as the house of the president in 1793 and 1794. Washington's looking to escape Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic, and sets this up both as his residence and his offices. Because the president's house that was in Philadelphia was torn down, this is the only surviving building that Washington actually occupied during his presidency and carried out his presidential duties in. So we're moving into the 19th century in 1824, and we're now at the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return, his triumphant return to America. He tours the country for the better part of a year. He arrives in Philadelphia in September of 1824, and there are all sorts of balls and fetes and these sort of things. But he comes back the following year to Germantown, and he actually receives guests at Wick. And if you haven't been to Wick recently, I guess this was maybe about 10 years ago, they had a chair that was returned to them from a descendant and the chair has an ownership history belonging to Benjamin Franklin, but supposedly Lafayette was seated in this chair and received guests in it at Wick. And then in 1830, about 6 years later, John Fanning Watson has been compiling and assembling all of this information about the founding fathers and the early colonial period of Pennsylvania. He's witnessing the passing of this generation, and this is kind of his imperative, is to put this out there. So it becomes, while it's criticized in some ways, it really inspires a lot of other history after that. And it becomes kind of the first great history of this era of Philadelphia. What Watson doesn't do is credit this woman, Deborah Norris Logan, who married into the Logan family. She actually married the grandson of James Logan, who we talked about earlier. And she was an equally able historian. She actually became the first woman member of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, published quite a bit. People like Watson, Charles Wilson Peale talk about going to her for advice. So she was a real sort of oracle of Philadelphia history. But unfortunately, that's gone unnoticed for a long time. So sort of moving into the modern era, one of the really transformative changes that happens is the Germantown and Norris Railroad. And this actually happens, this comes into being very near my site, Stenton, which you can see in this. We think this photograph is about 1877, and it's taken actually from the elevated rail bed. So you can see Stenton is still a farm at that time. That area is actually still pretty rural up until the end of the 19th century. The land is sold by a cousin of Deborah Norris Logan, a man named Thomas Fisher, to the railroad in 1830. And Deborah Norris Logan is really not very happy about this. This destroys her bucolic landscape that she loves writing about, and her cousin has sold off the land, and now she has to listen to trains rumbling through. In 1832, the first train comes through, which is built by Matthias Baldwin, and it's known as Old Ironsides, and you can see it in the lower right here, and you have these really kind of stagecoach-like cars that it's pulling. But yeah, Germantown is really transformed by that area down around what we think of as Wayne Junction today, ultimately industrializes in part because of it. So. Germantown has been on the forefront of the struggle for freedom for a long time, obviously going back to the 1688 petition initially, but abolitionists are very involved here. Of course, the Johnson House is a great survivor of that. It's the city's only documented Underground Railroad station. There's some evidence that William Still visited there. Fair Hill Burial Ground, which is a consortium member site, is the final resting place of Lucretia Mott and Robert Purvis. And in more recent times, Cliveden has really shifted its narrative to focus on particularly slavery at Cliveden. Choose involvement as potentially the largest slaveholder in Pennsylvania. The Conestoga wagon. The Conestoga wagon has a connection to Germantown, believe it or not. In fact, the first recorded reference in history to the Conestoga wagon is in an account book of James Logan's on December 31st of 1717, when he purchases what he calls a Conestoga wagon from James Hendricks. And so there is a sort of a Conestoga establishment. There's also a trading town that Logan is involved in creating. But the Conestoga town comes out of the Conestoga wagon comes out of Germantown. And so Germantown had this history of very much of kind of handicraft and trades, and there were joiners, there were potters. The textile industry was a strong part of Germantown. And as we move into the 19th century and into the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, we start to see large-scale mills, especially textile mills. You see Wakefield Mills here to the left. We have Midvale Steel, which is established just below Germantown, which is providing important steel products for Baldwin Locomotive, for instance. Germantown really changes pretty dramatically in the 19th century. And with the modern age comes all the positive and negative trappings of the modern era, including what is really the first widely covered kidnapping by the media in the United States. On July 1st of 1874, a young man named Charlie Ross and his brother were playing at their home on East Walnut Lane, and a couple of strangers stopped and offered them the proverbial candy, and Charlie and his brother were taken, sadly, and his brother was recovered, but Charlie never was. About 6 months later, two men were caught robbing a house in Brooklyn, New York, and one of them was killed instantly. The other one was wounded mortally, but before he died, he allegedly confessed to kidnapping Charlie Ross. And so Charlie's parents spent many years trying to recover Charlie, but never did. No one knows what happened to him. No body was ever found. And it's a fascinating story in a lot of ways. There were letters that the kidnappers sent demanding a $20,000 ransom. And these letters disappeared from history. They were actually published by the father after these alleged kidnappers were killed, in the hopes that it might lead to some trail to finding Charlie, and also absolve him. There was some finger pointing at him as well. But these letters sort of disappeared until, I don't know, it was within the last decade that they emerged again at auction, and they will ultimately be a part of the Germantown Historical Society collection. So, moving into the 20th century, Germantown is home to the fight for equality in a number of ways. One of the more extraordinary events that happens is in April of 1928. So Carter Woodson proposes an event called Negro Achievement Week, which ultimately becomes Black History Month in 1926. And in 1928, that event is held here in Germantown, and it is literally as if the Harlem Renaissance is transported to Germantown. We have all these luminaries: W.E.B. Du Bois, Elaine Locke, James Weldon Johnson, and they are using the Carnegie Library, what is today Center in the Park. They're using the YWCA. They're using all these facilities and to promote the progress of African Americans in Philadelphia. So it's a really extraordinary event that happens here that has been largely forgotten today, unfortunately. In 1944, there's the PTC strike, when the government is pressuring the Pennsylvania Transit Company to use African American employees because of the wartime shortages of labor. The white employees strike for about a week, and the government sends in 5,000 troops and stations armed troops throughout the city, including in Germantown, at stations, bus stops, and train stations along the way. It has makes a big mark and a big impact, I think, on a lot of people at that time. And then in the lower right corner, we see State Representative David Richardson, who served for many years. But as a young man, as a student at Germantown High in 1967, he led a walkout protesting the lack of African American content in the history curriculum. So. Germantown has a strong history of artists. Louisa May Alcott, although I think she only spent a couple of years of her life here, so that claim is a little dubious. But Margeurite de Angeli, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work in the mid-century. She's particularly focusing on racism and her experience growing up here in Germantown and some of her writings. Charles Wilson Peale lived in his retirement home at Belfield, and if you haven't been to LaSalle, Belfield still survives today. It's the president's house. It's actually part of some of our educational programs that we share with young people. And of course, Gilbert Stuart had his studio in Germantown as well, and painted a couple of portraits of Washington, but painted the famous Athenaeum portrait, which was never finished here. Continuing on in the 20th century, Sun Ra, who is one of the really kind of inspired Afrofuturism and was a true innovator of music. Kevin Eubanks, graduate of Germantown High. Tony Williams, Benton Spruance, who creates these iconic prints of Germantown in the 1930s and 40s. So that brings us to Germantown today. So that's sort of our whirlwind look of Germantown history and some of the things that make it so special. But this Germantown consortium that I mentioned at the beginning has been in existence now since 1982, although I don't think it was incorporated until 1985. And it has really evolved pretty dramatically during that time. When it first started, it was a loosely knit organization that organized around marketing things like Battle Day, which was around, marking the anniversary of the Battle of Germantown, and sort of other joint tours and things. And actually, when I started 17 years ago, I was handed a hand-ruled piece of paper that I think had $3,000 in a money market on it, and it was still an all-volunteer organization. Since then, it has merged with the Germantown Historical Society. It's fully staffed with an executive director, a program director, and it's really trying to pull these sites together and get them working together to share resources and to bring more resources to our historic sites in Germantown. But you can see the breadth of sites that we have here. I mean, we have, again, at least 3 cemeteries in the consortium. We have an arboretum. We have 2 art museums. And then we have all of these historic sites, which don't just represent the colonial and the revolutionary period, but represent this breadth of history, including the city's only unofficial African-American USO during World War II. It's really kind of remarkable what we have here in Germantown. But collectively, they're sponsors of over 100 lectures, tours, and events throughout the year. We educate about 10,000 school children. We leverage 25,000 hours of volunteer time and employing over 80 part-time and full-time. So you get a sense of, this looks as if you can walk to these sites. You cannot. You can walk from some. There are clusters that you can walk to. But I'd say it's probably 3 miles from Stenton to Clifton or so, something like that. And then even farther down to historic Fair Hill, which is our farthest site south. Germantown demographics. So I'll talk more about this in a minute, but one of the things we came to realize in recent years is that our audience is our community. Our audience is Germantown, that there are close to 50,000 people right here that we can tell these stories to, that we can draw into what we're trying to do in Germantown. And there are many more neighborhoods adjacent that will be interested in this. Germantown is largely African-American, over 75%. It has a high rate of poverty, about 30%. So those are things we try to keep in mind when we think about the types of programs and things that will be relevant and interesting to our audience. So again, this is if we had a quiz here, right? Here's our fast facts. Site of the first written protest against slavery, site of America's first paper mill, home of William Penn's secretary, site of the only Revolutionary War battle fought within the current city limits. It's the only underground railroad station open to the public, the only Victorian House Museum, the site of Negro Achievement Week. I mentioned the ACES, which is the African American USO Hall. In fact, there is this extraordinary concentration of Black founder-owned and operated museums here, lest we forget Black Writers, ACES, Johnson House. It's like nowhere else in the city. And individually, these are mostly small, private, nonprofit 501c3 organizations. There are a couple of exceptions to that. There's a National Park Service site and the LaSalle University Art Museum, but for the most part, these are little organizations which might have a staff member, might be all volunteer. They have an average budget size of about 200,000, fewer than 5,000 visitors per year, and let's face it, a real limited ability to bring in resources. But you put them together into this consortium, and suddenly you're talking about something that has $5 million in expenditures, you're collectively serving 100,000 people, and you have a significant impact on the community that you're in. So there's been a lot of talk in the historic site world over the last 2 decades about historic sites, about the problems with historic sites. This is not a new issue. The lack of attendance, the declining attendance, the lack of engagement, and organizations like the National Trust have been convening sites and wrestling with this for years. But what it boils down to is there are too many of them, and they're largely unsustainable. I think at last count, AAM or IMLS suggested that there was something like 18,000 historic sites across America, believe it or not. Of course, there's increased competition for audiences, for financial resources, and it gets back to the issue of relevance, right? Are we telling stories that are interesting to our audience? Who is our audience? Who are we trying to attract? But one thing I think in Germantown, at least, became very clear to us. When I first started, there was this great white whale of all we have to do is bring a trolley to Germantown. We just have to bring the visitors from Independence here, right? That's not going to happen. Old heritage tourism model really has gone by the wayside. And so we have to think about who our core audience is, and that's the people who live in this community. Doesn't mean that we aren't interested in outside visitors as well. We're always going to continue to try to attract them, but we have to recognize who our core audience is. So, as a consortium, one of the things we're thinking about is how can we do it differently, right? We can't be those insular historic sites anymore. We can't just be inward looking. And we have an opportunity here, I think, to create a new national model for how historic sites are. We have been doing that for quite a while now. And part of that means increased capacity to deliver better programs, higher quality programs. That means if there are 2 educators in Germantown and nobody else has one, right? Can we start sharing those staff? Can we start working together and planning programs together? Can we share community engagement coordinators, for instance? Can we share development staff? Can we take advantage of economies of scale? Can we, do group purchasing? Can we market ourselves jointly? And we did that first in 2008 when we created a new brand for historic Germantown called Freedom's Backyard and launched that. And so you'll see banners and things like that up and down the avenue that promote that. And then this idea of increased fundraising potential, which is really starting to bear fruit now. We have an executive director who's done a terrific job of making the case to funders that we're doing really good work. And we're able to do that because we're doing it collectively, because we're working together, because we're reaching more people together. Community also means removing barriers. So for a long time, there was this sort of put a fence up around it kind of mentality. We weren't seen as necessarily welcoming places to be. In fact, this is Stenton from several years ago. If you walked by on the outside fence, you see there's a high fence with razor wire and vines. It's difficult to see what's in there. So how do we overcome that? How do we start to see more welcoming? How do we start to reach neighbors? How do we provide leadership in the community and not just focus on our own needs, but think about the greater needs of Germantown? And then thinking about our audience, again, we're talking about a largely minority community that is really grappling with 21st century problems like poverty, like the educational achievement gaps. So how can we, within our mission, without going outside of our mission, help address some of those issues? So we've done a lot of things over the last few years that have helped us take steps as a group. And I just want to give you a couple examples of that. I think one of the things that we're most proud of is our History Hunters educational program, which has now been in service for over 20 years. This program really was, I think, the first model for how sites could work together, how they could share staff, how they could raise money together. And the basic concept is we have now 5 partner sites, but each site tells a different story. So at Stenton, we talk about the colonial period and Native American interactions. Clifton deals with the Revolution. Johnson House, of course, we're talking about the Underground Railroad. But by bringing all these sites together and offering a year-long curriculum to students, we can now offer really a broad sweep of American history, this dramatic sweep from the colonial period up to the Civil War. And there's not many places that can do that, right? If we're all just offering our own individual thing, we can only focus on our narrow slice of the story. Another thing that we really targeted in on, again, thinking about our community's needs, is that it would be free to underserved students. So over 90% of the students we serve are on the free lunch program. They come from low-income households. The city of everybody knows, they follow the city of Philadelphia and the school district's financial woes and all the cuts that the school district made many years ago. And so bus transportation is a major issue. So we decided from the outset that we were going to provide transportation for free. So classes within the school district that participate in this get free transportation to all 5 sites. We tied it to state and city education standards to make it easy for the teachers. The teachers have testing standards they have to do, right? So this makes it easy for them to make the case to their principal. We included educators and humanities consultants in the development process. And then we looked at history from multiple perspectives. So thinking about, again, African-American history, women's history, history that's sometimes overlooked in textbooks, and how can we fill in the gaps? So in the 20 years that we've now been doing this, we've served over 40,000 Philadelphia school children through this program, which again, if this was just Stenton doing this, or Wick doing this, or Johnson House doing this, there's no way we could pull off a program like this. It's only through collaboration. We've been able to standardize our educational programming. We've been able to create joint administration and staffing. So the nice thing about this is that there's central administration at Stenton, so none of the partner sites have to go and schedule a visit. It's all done at the beginning of the year at one site. The guides are scheduled, the guides are centrally trained in how to deliver the program. They go to the sites, they deliver the program, that's it. The partner sites don't have to really do anything else. And then fundraising, more than $2 million has been raised for this program, including an endowment for it. So it shows the power of high quality programming, and that even small organizations can make the case if they're doing it well and doing it together. So that led to this idea that, oh, this could be something bigger, right? We're having success with this educational program. HD can be something more. We can dramatically increase our fundraising together. We can offer more high quality programs, more sharing, more joint marketing possibilities. We can just do a lot more together than we can individually. And this is kind of where we are today as an organization. We have a number of initiatives that are ongoing, one of which is Second Saturdays. So if you're interested in exploring these 19 sites, this is an opportunity for you every month to actually see the sites during joint hours. They're offered free to the public. A lot of the sites have enticements and different things that they're doing to get you interested and bring you in. We do a lot of events and festivals that involve multiple sites collectively. These would be things like the Revolutionary Germantown Festival at Cliveden, Juneteenth at the Johnson House, the People's Poetry and Jazz Festival at the Black Writers Museum, the Harvest Festival at Aubrey Arboretum. We have Honey Fest at Wick and the Rose Festival. Rittenhousetown has a fair now. There's a summer festival at Historic Fair Hill. So there's lots to do throughout the year. We've got over 100 types of different exhibits, special programs, tours, lectures. You can tour each site individually, of course. There's really something kind of for everyone. Again, education, we've talked about History Hunters already, but History Hunters is not the only example. Grumblethorpe has been offering a program called the Grumblethorpe Youth Volunteer Program for, gosh, probably as long as History Hunters. And it is really an extraordinary program geared to a small number of students, ages 12 through 18. They recruit these students when they're younger. They often stay for multiple years in the program. They help with harvest the gardens at Grumblethorpe. They run the farm stands on Saturdays. They learn how to interact with the public. They learn the business side of it, how to do these transactions. There's a lot there for them, and it's a great model of how we can hopefully cultivate the next generation of preservation leaders in Germantown. Green Spaces is one of our more recent initiatives. We actually have over 80 acres of green spaces combined throughout these 19 member sites. It's a combination of lawns, formal gardens, again, arboreta, cemeteries. There's a little bit of everything that you can experience. And then community engagement. And this is really sort of drilling down on our neighbors, our audience, on Germantown, on who we're trying to reach. So it's not an easy thing to define. It's a combination of things. It involves partnerships. It involves outreach. It also involves equity. It involves thinking about how we run these sites. Let's face it, for most of these sites' history, many of them were white elite organizations. So it's about reaching out and bringing in a more diverse group of people and involving them in the governance of the sites. So yeah, it's not sort of one thing, but it is, and it's not transactional either. But I'll give you an example of one of the things that I'll end with that we've been doing at Stenton. And this was a project to memorialize an enslaved woman named Dinah. And this project started in 2017 when we were offered this monument to James Logan by the Association for Public Art. And this monument had been stored it was initially created in 1939 by Thomas Pimcote for an annex building of the Library Company of Philadelphia. That annex building went out of business, it went into storage. PMA, it ended up at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and they wanted to get it out. The Association for Public Art couldn't find anybody else to take it, and they said, well, you guys talk about James Logan, don't you want it? So as we started thinking about it and deciding, whether or not we would accept this, there was this national conversation that emerged about monuments and who should be memorialized, and is it appropriate to memorialize enslavers? And the flip side of that is the absence of memorials to African Americans, the lack of memorials in our public spaces that recognize the contributions of African Americans. So one of the things that came up in our discussions was this plaque, which is also in our collection at Stewart, in our collections at Stenton. And this was erected by the Colonial Dames and by the Site and Relic Society of Germantown, which is now Germantown Historical Society, in 1912 in Stenton Park. And it memorializes this woman, Dinah, and this story about her saving the house from burning by the British during the Revolution in 1777. And this story was very well known. It's been known throughout Germantown for at least 150 years, but it focused exclusively on that aspect of her life. So what we ultimately decided was, okay, we'll accept the Logan Memorial, but we have to bring equity to the stories we tell and to the representation of those stories. And that meant creating a new memorial to Dinah and thinking about how to memorialize her story in the 21st century. How would we do that? How would we tell her story? The other thing we knew we wanted to do was we knew we wanted to overcome those barriers, those high fences, right? That perception that Stenton was not a welcoming place, that it was not a place for our neighbors. So we decided from the outset that we had to invite our neighbors in and ask them to be a part of this work we were doing. So we ended up getting a $300,000 grant from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, which helped fund 2 years of these community facilitated conversations. And it was asking neighbors, how did they want to see Dinah memorialized? How should we tell her story? What stories do they want to hear us tell? And how can we be, as an institution, be better neighbors and better partners? And that was really the first time as a museum that we had allowed our neighbors to be a part of the decision-making process. So that was a real sea change for us. And that led to other things. It sort of snowballed from there, right? As we started meeting neighbors, we started thinking about opportunities together. We happened to be located on the corner of a public park, but we had really never been connected with that public park. So we started working with the local recreation center and the advisory committee that were the caretakers for the park. And that led to a partnership that involved other neighbors where we would jointly plan things. And we were thinking about things like access. At the time, we only had one gate that was open, and you had to walk all the way around from the park to get to it. So we said, all right, let's open 2 more gates. And let's do programs with the advisory council, but let's do them in the park, not on Stenton's grounds. And maybe we'll have some activities or refreshments on Stenton's grounds afterwards, and that's how we'll draw people in. But we really wanted to get outside of the fence and into the community. And part of that, more recently, has been actually hiring a community engagement coordinator. And that's her sole job, is to be out in the neighborhood, talking to people, finding out what's happening, finding out what the opportunity areas are, where the synergy is. One of the really serendipitous aspects of this whole project was we learned that the leaders of the Stenton Park Advisory Council had also been thinking about Dinah, and they knew her story, even though we'd never met, never talked about it, and they wanted to memorialize it in some way, and they had this idea of creating a mural at the same time, almost exactly the same time, that we had the idea of creating the memorial to her. So we've been close partners ever since. And here you can actually see the unveiling of this mural. And ultimately, it was one of our donors who gave the last amount to complete the mural, to get it going. And we had our donors, and we had community members, and everybody was sort of there together for this unveiling. It was really fantastic. And then finally, last Saturday, after a lot of pandemic delays and supply chain issues, we had our own unveiling of the Dinah Memorial. And the great thing about it was, one of the things I was concerned about with pandemic disruptions and kind of the long time period that elapsed from when we started this project. We got the grant at the end of 2018, was losing that energy, losing that connection with our neighbors. But this really showed that we hadn't, that everybody was still invested, that we had done the work we needed to do in making those connections, because we had well over 200 people who turned out. We had a number of neighbors who spoke, and everyone was engaged and excited about this. And now we have this incredible new space in our landscape to interpret Dinah's story, to use it as a jumping off point to talk about other enslaved and indentured individuals at Stenton, and to elevate those stories on par with the stories of the Logans in a way that we hadn't been doing before. So I'll leave you with this subliminal message. Visit all 19 attractions, and I'm happy to take questions.